The mud outside the Broken Spur saloon was not merely earth and water. It was a living, malevolent slurry that swallowed boot heels and hope with equal indifference. Inside, the air was thick enough to chew a suffocating stew of stale beer, unwashed wool, cheap tobacco smoke, and the sharp copper tang of despair. It was the kind of place where men came to forget their names, and where women came only if they had run out of every other option on God's green earth. Seraphina Dove stood near the swinging doors, the damp hem of her calico dress heavy with the muck of the street. She was 23, though the hollows beneath her eyes and the sharp angle of her cheekbones made her look older, haunted. Her hands, red-knuckled and trembling, gripped the rough wood of the doorframe as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. She made no sound. She never made a sound, not when the cold wind bit through her thin shawl, not when the hunger twisted her stomach into knots, and not now, as her uncle, Elias Rook, stumbled toward the bar, his boots dragging on the sawdust floor. Elias was a ruin of a man. His face was a map of broken veins, his nose bulbous and red from a lifetime of worshipping the bottle. He smelled of old sweat and rot-gut whiskey, a stench that seemed to ooze from his very pores. He slammed a fist onto the scarred mahogany of the bar. "Whiskey!" Elias roared, his voice cracking. "Pour it, you stingy rat!" The bartender, a man with eyes like flint and a scar running through his eyebrow, didn't move. He wiped a glass with a rag that was greasier than the floor. "You got coin, Rook?" the bartender asked flatly. "Or are you planning to pay with more of your lies?" Elias patted his pockets. He dug into his vest. He turned out the lining of his coat. "Button, dust." I'm good for it," Elias stammered, his bravado crumbling into the desperate shaking need of the addict. "Just one shot, to warm the blood. I'll bring you silver tomorrow. I swear on my mother's grave." "Your mother's been spinning in her grave so long she's halfway to China," the bartender spat. "No coin, no pour. Get out." The rejection hit Elias like a physical blow. He swayed, his eyes darting around the room, looking for a friend, a mark, a savior. There were none. The miners and trappers hunching over their tables ignored him. They knew Elias Rook. They knew he was a leech. Then, Elias's watery gaze landed on the door, on Seraphina. A slow, twisted smile spread across his face. It was a look of sudden, horrific inspiration. He lunged across the room, grabbing Seraphina by the wrist. His grip was surprisingly strong, fueled by the panic of withdrawal. "Come here, girl," he hissed, dragging her into the center of the room. Seraphina pulled back, her boots skidding on the sawdust. She opened her mouth to scream, to beg, but nothing came out, just a sharp intake of breath. The silence was her cage, forged 10 years ago in a pool of her parents' blood, and she had never found the key. Elias hauled her toward a large round poker table in the center of the room. He shoved a miner off his chair and kicked the chair away. Elias screamed. He grabbed Seraphina by the waist and hoisted her onto the table. She scrambled for purchase, her skirts bunching around her knees, her face burning with a humiliation so profound it felt like her skin was being flayed. The saloon went quiet. The piano player stopped mid-chord. Seraphina knelt on the sticky wood, surrounded by the faces of men who looked at her, not as a woman, but as a curiosity, a thing. She pulled her shawl tight around her shoulders, her eyes wide and terrified, darting from face to face. "Gentlemen," Elias shouted, spreading his arms wide, swaying on his heels, "I am a man of commerce, and I have run dry." He pointed a shaking finger at Seraphina. "Look at her, young, strong. She can scrub a floor until you see your own ugly face in it. She can cook. She can mend." He grabbed her chin, forcing her face up toward the lantern light. "And best of all," Elias leered, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that carried to the back of the room, "she don't talk back. Not a word. Not a peep. She's mute as a stone, boys. A silent woman, the eighth wonder of the world." Laughter rippled through the crowd. It was a dark, jagged sound. "She broke?" a miner shouted. "Or just stupid?" "She's damaged," Elias laughed, slapping Seraphina's leg. "But she works, and I am a thirsty man. I ain't asking for gold. I ain't asking for silver." He held up a single finger. "One bottle," Elias pleaded, looking at the bartender. "One full bottle of your top-shelf rye. For the girl. She's yours. Do what you want. Take her home. Put her to work." Seraphina's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. One bottle, she thought, the words screaming in her mind. "I am worth one bottle of poison." She looked at the faces. Lust, amusement, indifference, not 1 ounce of pity. If you are liking this story, please subscribe. I know you must have subscribed by now, so let's continue. "I'll give you a half bottle," a voice croaked from the corner. It was a trapper with no teeth and a face like a dried apple. "She looks skinny. Probably eats more than she's worth." "Done!" Elias shrieked, desperate for the burn in his throat. "Soldier the man in the corner. Bring me the bottle." The bartender sighed, reached under the bar, and pulled out a bottle of amber liquid. He slid it down the wood toward Elias. Elias scrambled for it. He grabbed the neck of the bottle like it was the throat of a lover. He pulled the cork with his teeth and spat it onto the floor. "Wait." The word was not shouted. It was not screamed. It was spoken in a voice that sounded like a coffin lid slamming shut. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The laughter died instantly. The swinging doors, which had been still, slowly creaked open. A man stepped inside. He was a giant. He had to duck his head to clear the doorframe. He wore a coat made of heavy buffalo hide, the fur matted with rain and snow, making his shoulders look as wide as a mountain pass. His hat was pulled low, dripping water onto the floor, but beneath the brim, eyes the color of winter ice scanned the room. Thane Blackwood. They called him the Grave, because he was silent, and because he filled so many of them. He lived above the snow line, trapping beasts that other men feared to track. He walked into the room, his boots heavy. Iron-shod things made a rhythmic, terrifying thud-thud-thud on the floorboards. He didn't look at the bartender. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked at Seraphina. He looked at her kneeling on the table, clutching her shawl. He looked at the terror in her eyes. He looked at the silence that wrapped around her like a shroud. Then he looked at Elias Rook, who was raising the bottle to his lips. Thane stopped 10 feet away. He stood perfectly still, a monolith of violence waiting to happen. "Put it down," Thane rumbled. His voice was a low vibration that rattled the glasses on the shelf. Elias froze. He lowered the bottle slowly. He blinked, trying to focus on the mountain of a man standing before him. "Stay out of it, Blackwood," Elias slurred, trying to muster some courage. "Business transaction, fair trade. The girl for the drink." "She ain't currency," Thane said. "She's mine," Elias spat. "My blood. I can spend her how I like. She's a mute curse anyway." Elias raised the bottle again, defiant. "To the buyer," he toasted. Thane's hand moved. It was a blur of motion too fast for a man of his size. Crack! The sound of the Colt Dragoon clearing leather was loud. The shot was deafening. Boom! The bottle in Elias's hand exploded. Glass shards and amber liquid sprayed everywhere into Elias's eyes, into his mouth, soaking his shirt. Elias screamed, dropping the jagged neck of the bottle, clutching his face. The room erupted into chaos for a split second, men diving for cover, chairs scraping before falling into a terrified silence. Thane stood there, the smoke drifting lazily from the barrel of the massive revolver. He hadn't aimed for the man. He had aimed for the noise. He holstered the gun. He walked forward. Elias was on his knees, weeping, picking glass out of his cheek. Thane reached down. He grabbed Elias by the lapels of his filthy coat and hauled him to his feet effortlessly. "You like silence?" Thane asked. His voice was terrifyingly calm. Elias whimpered. Thane drew back his fist, a hand like a sledgehammer wrapped in leather, and struck Elias once across the jaw. Whack! It was a meaty, brutal sound. Elias Rook's lights went out instantly. He crumpled to the floor like a sack of wet grain, unconscious before he hit the sawdust. Thane stepped over the body. He looked around the room. His gaze swept over the miners, the trappers, the bartender. "Anyone else want to speak?" he asked. Silence. Absolute, terrified silence. The man in the corner who had bit a half bottle shrank back into the shadows, making himself as small as possible. Thane turned to the table. He looked at Seraphina. She hadn't moved. She hadn't flinched at the gunshot. She was staring at him, her eyes wide, reflecting the lantern light. She was trembling, vibrating with a frequency of fear that he could almost feel in the air. He reached out. Seraphina flinched, closing her eyes, waiting for the blow. Thane's hands, massive and scarred, grasped her waist. He didn't grab her. He encompassed her. He lifted her off the table. She weighed nothing to him, a bird, a feather. He set her on her feet, but her legs gave way. He caught her. He swept her up into his arms, holding her against the rough, wet fur of his coat. She smelled of rain and fear. He smelled of pine resin, gunpowder, and the deep, cold solitude of the high peaks. "Quiet now," he rumbled against her hair. He turned and walked out. He pushed through the swinging doors, carrying her into the storm. The rain was coming down in sheets, icy and relentless. His horse, a massive Clydesdale mix that looked more like a war machine than a mount, was tied at the rail. Thane didn't ask if she wanted to go. He didn't ask her name. He lifted her onto the saddle, settling her in front of the pommel. He swung up behind her, his massive frame shielding her from the wind. He wrapped one arm around her waist to hold her steady. His arm was heavy, solid as an iron bar. He kicked the horse. The beast snorted and surged forward, hooves churning the mud, carrying them away from the lights of the saloon, away from the unconscious uncle, and into the dark, swallowing throat of the mountains. Seraphina leaned back against his chest, unable to stop the shivering, listening to the only sound that mattered, the steady, rhythmic beat of a heart that seemed too big for the world it lived in. She was no longer a bottle of whiskey. She was something else, something stolen, or perhaps something saved. The ascent into the high Rockies was not a journey measured in miles, but in the brutal subtraction of comfort. The rain that had turned the mining town into a pigsty hardened as they climbed, transforming first into stinging sleet that lashed against Seraphina's exposed skin, and then, as the air grew thin and biting, into a dry, swirling snow that hissed across the granite like sand. Seraphina clung to the saddle horn, her knuckles white, her body pressed back against the massive chest of the man who had taken her. Thane Blackwood was a furnace behind her, a wall of heat and wet wool that blocked the worst of the wind, but the cold still found its way in. It seeped through the thin soles of her boots, turning her toes into blocks of ice. It gnawed at her fingers until they felt like brittle twigs that might snap if she tried to bend them. She couldn't see much. The world had dissolved into a monochromatic nightmare of gray rock and white drifts. The only constant was the rhythmic tectonic movement of the horse beneath them. The beast climbed with a terrifying power, its hooves striking sparks against the shale, heaving them up switchbacks so narrow that Seraphina shut her eyes to avoid looking into the abyss that yawned to their left. She didn't speak. She couldn't. But her mind was a cacophony of terror. "Who is he?" she screamed internally. "He didn't pay for me. He took me. Is he a savior? Or is he a wolf dragging a carcass back to his den? Thane didn't speak either. He rode with the silence of a man who had forgotten the sound of his own voice. He guided the horse with his knees, his hands resting heavily on his thighs, seemingly unbothered by the gale that was trying to tear them off the mountain. Hours bled into a frozen eternity. Just when Seraphina thought her heart would stop from the sheer crushing weight of the cold, the wind abruptly died. They had entered a box canyon, sheltered by sheer cliffs that rose 1,000 feet on 3 sides. Down, Thane grunted. The word was a vibration in his chest, felt more than heard. The horse stopped. Seraphina sat frozen, her limbs locked in place. Thane dismounted. He hit the ground with a heavy thud that crunched through the snow crust. He didn't offer a hand. He simply reached up, grabbed her by the waist with hands that felt like iron clamps, and swung her down. Her legs, numb and useless, folded beneath her. She collapsed into the snow, the powder biting her face. Thane sighed, a sound of profound irritation, like a bear waking up too early. He bent down, scooped her up by the back of her coat like a stray kitten, and marched toward a dark shape at the base of the cliff. He kicked a heavy timber door. Creak, creak. He carried her inside. The transition was violent. One moment, she was in a screaming white void. The next, she was enveloped in a profound, heavy stillness. The air inside was stale, smelling of pine pitch, old wood smoke, curing leather, and the metallic tang of cold iron. It was pitch black. Stand, Thane commanded. He dropped her. Not cruelly, but with the lack of ceremony one gives to a sack of flour. Seraphina landed on her feet, stumbled, and caught herself on a rough-hewn table. She stood shivering in the dark, her teeth chattering so hard her jaw ached. She heard him moving heavy, deliberate steps, the strike of a lucifer match, the hiss of a lantern flaring to life. Light flooded the room. The cabin was a fortress. Built of logs the width of whiskey barrels, it was low and squat, huddled against the rock face which formed the back wall. It was a single, cavernous room. The walls were hung with the tools of his trade, steel traps with jagged teeth, coils of rope, rifles of various calibers, and the skulls of animals he had bested. It was a bachelor's den, chaotic and grim. A pile of furs lay in the corner, his bed. A table in the center was buried under a drift of dirty tin plates, coffee grounds, and disassembled gun parts. Thane turned to her. In the lantern light he looked even bigger. His face was a landscape of harsh terrain, a beard like tangled wire, a scar running from his temple to his jaw, and eyes that watched her with a flat, unreadable assessment. He pointed to a rough wooden chair near the cold hearth. Sit, he growled. Seraphina nodded, terrified to disobey. She walked to the chair, her boots loud on the floorboards, and sat on the edge, clutching her shawl. Thane walked to the hearth. He grabbed a handful of kindling and shoved it into the stove. He lit it. The fire caught, roaring up the chimney, casting long, dancing shadows that made the animal skulls on the wall look alive. He turned back to her. He loomed over her, blocking the light. Listen to me, he said, his voice rough with disuse. I ain't a nursery maid, and I ain't looking for a wife. Seraphina pressed her back against the chair, her eyes wide. She brought her hands up slowly to her throat, then lowered them to her lap, lacing her fingers together until the knuckles turned white. Thane paced the floor, running a hand through his wet hair. I took you because I hate noise. And Rook is nothing but noise, but that don't mean I want you here. He stopped, pointing a finger at her. You sleep there, he said, gesturing to a pile of buffalo robes near the woodbox, far from his own bed. When the pass clears in the spring, you go. You go to the city. You go anywhere but here. Understand? Seraphina nodded slowly. Spring? That was months away. I have to see to the horse, Thane muttered, grabbing a bucket. Don't touch the traps. They bite, and don't touch the guns." He paused, looking at her with a sudden dark intensity. "And don't make a sound. I like the quiet." He grabbed his rifle and walked out. The heavy door slammed shut. The locking bar thudded home from the outside. Serafina was alone. For a long time she didn't move. The silence of the cabin was heavier than the noise of the saloon. Here, the silence had teeth. She shivered. The fire was growing, but the cold was inside her. "He thinks I am broken," she thought. "He thinks I am a piece of furniture he has to dust until spring." She looked around the room. It was a disaster. It wasn't just messy. It was neglected. The floor was scattered with pine needles and dried mud. A tin plate on the table was crusted with days-old grease. But it was the larder that drew her attention. In the corner, shelves were stacked with provisions, but they were in chaos. A sack of flour had tipped over, spilling white dust over a pile of onions that were beginning to sprout. A side of bacon hung precariously from a nail, dripping grease onto a pile of clean shirts. Serafina stood up. Her legs were shaky, but her resolve was iron. She had survived the death of her parents. She had survived the silence. She had survived her uncle. She would survive the mountain man. But to survive, she had to be useful. If she was useful, he wouldn't throw her out. She walked to the larder. She moved with the quiet grace of a ghost. She righted the flour sack. She gathered the onions, peeling away the rotting skins and stacking them in a wooden bowl. She moved the bacon, hanging it securely on a hook near the chimney where the smoke would keep it. She found a broom made of stiff twigs. She swept the floor. She swept the pine needles into the fire. She swept the mud from the boots of the man who had terrified her. Then she saw his coat. Not the one he was wearing, but another one, a heavy wool coat thrown over a barrel. It was gray, thick and warm, but the sleeve was torn open, exposing the lining. Serafina ran her hand over the tear. "He walks through thorns," she thought. "He doesn't care." She looked around. On the mantel, amidst a clutter of cartridges and whetstones, she saw a tin box. She opened it. A bone needle. A spool of heavy linen thread. She smiled, a small, terrified, secret thing. She sat by the fire, the heavy coat draped over her lap. In, out, in, out. The work was meditative. It was a language she could speak. "I am here," the needle said. "I am not a burden," the thread whispered. "I earn my keep." Hours passed. The storm raged outside, shaking the heavy timbers, but inside the cabin began to change. It didn't smell like musk and wet fur anymore. It smelled of order. Suddenly the bar lifted. Thud. The door swung open. Thane blew in with a gust of snow. He looked exhausted. His beard was frosted white, and he dragged a saddlebag in his left hand. He looked like a man expecting to find a cold, dark cabin and a weeping girl. He stopped. He blinked. The floor was clean. The table was cleared of the gun parts, which were now lined up in perfect rows on a shelf. The fire was roaring, banking perfectly against the back of the chimney. He looked at the larder. The chaos was gone. He looked at Serafina. She was sitting by the fire, her hands resting in her lap. She looked up at him. Her eyes were dark and unreadable. Next to her, folded neatly on the bench, was his spare coat. Thane dropped the saddlebag. He walked over to the bench. He picked up the coat. He saw the sleeve. The tear was gone. It was stitched back into place with tiny, perfect white stitches that stood out against the gray wool like a scar. He ran his thumb over the seam. It was stronger than the original sewing. He turned slowly to look at her. "I told you not to touch my things," he grumbled, but the anger was gone from his voice, replaced by a confused, grudging rumble. Serafina didn't flinch. She simply raised her hands. She pointed to the coat. Then she pointed to the fire. Then she pointed to herself. Warmth, she gestured, mimicking pulling a blanket tight. Survival. Thane stared at her for a long moment. He saw the blister on her thumb from the needle. He saw the way she sat spine straight, chin up, despite the fear he knew she felt. He let out a long breath, the tension in his shoulders dropping an inch. "You missed a spot on the floor," he lied, his voice gruff. He walked to the fire and warmed his hands. He didn't say thank you. He didn't smile. But when he sat down at the table, he didn't turn his back to her. He pulled out a piece of dried venison from his pocket and cut a slice. He held it out to her. Serafina hesitated, then she took it. They ate in silence. But it wasn't the silence of the saloon, filled with threat and noise. It was the silence of the snow deep, covering, and for the first time in Serafina's life, shared. The blizzard that descended on the high Rockies 3 days later did not arrive with a howl. It arrived with a suffocating, heavy silence that pressed against the eardrums like deep water. The wind, which had been stripping the needles from the pines for 2 days, abruptly died. The sky turned a bruised, heavy purple, and the air inside the cabin grew thick and static-charged, making the hair on Serafina's arms stand up. Thane had been restless all day. He had paced the small floor, checking the bar on the door, checking the shutters, checking the rifles. He moved with a heavy, dragging gait that Serafina, sitting by the fire mending a tear in his spare shirt, tracked with her eyes. Scuff, drag, pause, wheeze. He was favoring his left leg. He had been favoring it since they arrived, but today, he wasn't just limping. He was hauling the limb as if it were dead wood. Serafina set the shirt down. She stood up and walked to him. She reached out to touch his arm. Thane recoiled. "I'm fine," he growled, turning away from her to grab the water bucket. "Just the weather and the bone. Old trap wound." He reached for the door latch. "I need snow. Bucket's dry." He missed the latch. His hand swiped clumsily at the wood. He swayed, like a great pine whose roots had finally snapped in a gale. Serafina rushed forward, her mouth opening in a silent scream, but she was too small to catch a falling mountain. Thane collapsed. The impact of his body hitting the floor shook the entire cabin. The water bucket clattered away, rolling into the shadows. Serafina was on her knees beside him in a heartbeat. She turned him over. He was burning. Even through the thick wool of his shirt, the heat radiating from him was terrifying. It was a dry, feverish fire that seemed to be consuming him from the inside out. His skin was gray beneath the beard, and his eyes were rolled back, showing the whites. She didn't waste time trying to wake him. She grabbed the hem of his buckskin trousers. She pulled out his heavy skinning knife from his belt and sliced the leather open from the ankle to the knee. The smell hit her first, a sickly, sweet odor of rot that cut through the scent of pine and wood smoke. There, on his calf, was the source. It was an old scarred, jagged teeth marks from a bear trap. He must have pried off himself years ago. But something had reopened it. A splinter? A thorn? It didn't matter. The wound was angry, red, swollen tight and shiny, radiating streaks of black poison that were tracking up toward his thigh. Septic. Serafina knew what this was. She had seen men die of it in the mining camps. It killed fast, and it killed painfully. She looked at Thane's face. He was muttering now, thrashing his head. "The cannons!" he rasped, his voice thick with delirium. "Too loud! Stop the drums! Bury them!" He wasn't in the cabin. He was back in whatever war had carved the happiness out of him. He was fighting ghosts. Serafina didn't panic. Her silence, often a curse, was now her armor. She didn't waste breath on screaming. She didn't waste time asking questions. She stood up. She ran to the fire. She grabbed the heavy iron poker. She shoved the tip into the heart of the coals. She went to the larder. She found a bottle of whiskey, the one thing Elias Rook had loved more than her. She grabbed a clean rag. She returned to Thane. She poured the whiskey over the wound. Thane hissed, his body arching off the floor, but he didn't wake. The alcohol washed away the pus, revealing the depth of the infection. It had to be burned out. If she didn't stop the poison, it would stop his heart. Serafina looked at the poker. It was glowing a dull, angry cherry red. She looked at Thane. "I am sorry," she thought. "I am so sorry." She sat on his good leg to pin him down. She took his heavy hand and placed it on her shoulder, giving him something to crush. She took a breath. She pressed the iron to the wound. Thane didn't scream. He roared. It was a sound torn from the bottom of his soul, a primal release of agony that rivaled the storm outside. His hand clamped onto her shoulder, his grip bruising, crushing, desperate. The smell of searing flesh and singing hair filled the small room, acrid and sickening. Serafina didn't flinch. Tears streamed down her face, but she held the iron steady until the sizzling stopped, until the wound was sealed in a brutal, blackened line. Then she threw the iron aside. Thane went limp. He passed out, his head lolling back onto the wood, his breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches. The next 3 days were a blur of firelight and shadows. The storm buried the cabin. The snow piled up past the windows, sealing them in a tomb of ice. Inside, the battle for Thane's life raged on. Serafina became a creature of constant motion. She changed the dressings every hour. She bathed his forehead with cool snowmelt. She held him down when the fever dreams made him fight invisible enemies. "Quiet!" he would shout in the night, his eyes wide and unseeing. "Make it stop! The noise! The screaming!" Serafina would lean over him. She couldn't speak to him. She couldn't tell him the war was over, so she did the only thing she could. She placed her hands over his ears. She pressed her palms gently against the sides of his head, blocking out the world, blocking out the phantom cannons. Thane would freeze. He would look up at her, confusion warring with the fever in his eyes, and then he would sag back into the furs, the tension leaving his body. Her silence was the only thing that could drown out his noise. On the 4th morning the wind died. The silence that followed was heavy and profound. The sun, weak and pale, filtered through the cracks in the shutters. Thane opened his eyes. The delirium was gone. The pale blue was clear, though exhausted. He lay still, listening. He expected to hear the wind. He expected to hear the ringing in his ears that had plagued him since the artillery shell at Shiloh. But there was nothing. Just the crackle of the fire and the soft, rhythmic sound of breathing. He turned his head. Serafina was sitting on the floor beside him, her back against the woodbox. She was asleep, her head lolling on her chest. Her face was gray with exhaustion, dark circles bruising the skin under her eyes. Her hands, stained with herbs and soot, lay open in her lap. Thane tried to sit up. A groan escaped him. Serafina's eyes snapped open. She was awake instantly, scrambling to her knees, her mouth opened in a silent gasp, her hands fluttering to his face. Thane caught her wrist. His grip was weak, shaking, but his skin was cool. The fever had broken. "You stayed," he rasped. His voice was a wreck, like gravel in a grinder. Serafina nodded. She reached for the water cup and held it to his lips. He drank greedily, some of it spilling into his beard. He lay back, staring at the ceiling beams. "I thought I was dead," he whispered. "I heard the guns again. I heard the men screaming." He turned his head to look at her. But then the quiet came, cool, dark quiet. He looked at her hands, the hands that had held the hot iron, the hands that had covered his ears. "Why?" he asked. "You could have taken the horse. You could have left me to rot. I bought you for a bottle of whiskey, girl. I ain't no saint." Seraphina set the cup down. She looked at him with a fierce intensity. She shook her head. She reached out and tapped his chest, right over his heart. Thump! Then she tapped her own. Thump! "Same," she sighed, interlacing her fingers. Thane stared at her. "We the same?" Seraphina nodded. She reached out and touched the scar on his temple, the one from the war. Then she touched her own throat. Thane frowned. He reached up, his large hand covering hers on her neck. He felt the pulse there. He felt the scars of a different kind of trauma, the invisible ones. "Why don't you speak?" he asked softly. "Is it broken? Or just locked?" Seraphina looked down. She took his hand and guided it to her throat. She closed her eyes. She mimicked a slashing motion across her neck, not a threat, but a memory. "I saw death." Then she moved his hand to her lips. She pressed his palm against her mouth. "And I promise never to scream again." Thane understood. He saw the little girl hiding under a bed or in a closet, watching her world end, and deciding that words were useless against such evil. "I hate the noise," Thane whispered, confessing the secret he kept from everyone. "The world is too loud. Men lie, guns bang, fools shout." He moved his hand from her mouth to her cheek. He cupped her face, his thumb brushing away a smear of soot. "But you," he breathed, "you are the eye of the storm. You are the only peace I've found in 20 years. Seraphina leaned into his hand, her eyes filled with tears, not of pain but of being seen. For the first time her silence wasn't a defect. It was a gift. Thane shifted, ignoring the pain in his leg. He pulled her down until her head rested on his chest. "Rest now," he commanded softly. "I'll watch the door." Seraphina closed her eyes, listening to the slow, steady beat of his heart. It was the only sound she wanted to hear. They lay there in the firelight, two broken things that fit together perfectly, realizing that in a world of screaming men, the most powerful bond was the one that didn't need a single word. Which country are you watching this video from? Please let me know in the comments below. The thaw did not arrive with a whisper. It arrived with a violent cracking groan of the earth waking up from a 6-month coma. The silence of the deep winter, which had cocooned Seraphina and Thane in a fragile healing peace, was shattered by the roar of the creek. Swollen with black meltwater and sludge, it tore through the ravine below the cabin like a gouge in the mountain, carrying boulders the size of wagons in its frothing jaw. Inside the cabin, the air had changed. It was no longer the stale, recycled breath of two people trapped in a wooden lung. It was heavy with moisture, smelling of wet wool, damp earth, and the sharp green scent of pine resin warming in the sun. Thane sat on the heavy oak bench near the door, his legs stretched out stiffly. The trap wound in his calf had healed into an angry, knotted pucker of scar tissue that pulled tight every time the barometric pressure dropped, leaving him with a permanent, rolling limp. He was cleaning his rifle, a heavy Sharps buffalo gun that fired a cartridge the size of a man's thumb. Scrape oil, click. The rhythm was soothing, but his eyes were not. They were fixed on the window, watching the steam rise from the melting snow in the yard. His instincts, sharpened by a lifetime of solitude, were screaming. The jays had stopped scolding in the spruce trees. The squirrels had vanished. The mountain was holding its breath. Seraphina was at the hearth. She was humming a low, hesitant vibration in her throat that she was still learning to use. She was kneading dough for biscuits, her hands flour-dusted and strong. She wasn't the skeletal ghost Thane had carried out of the saloon. Her cheeks had filled out, flushed with the heat of the fire and the steady diet of venison stew. She stopped kneading. Her hands hovered over the board. She turned to him. She didn't speak, but her eyes were wide. She tapped her ear. "Listen." Thane paused. "What is it? The creek?" Seraphina shook her head. She made a motion with her hand, a flat palm slicing through the air. Man! Thane swore softly. He peered through the crack in the heavy shutter. Down in the muddy yard, emerging from the mist like wraiths of dirty smoke, were 7 riders. They were picking their way up the treacherous, slushy path, their horses blowing hard in the thin air. Leading them, riding a sway-backed mare that looked as mean as its master, was Elias Rook. He looked worse than Seraphina remembered. His coat was stained with months of tobacco juice and vomit. His face was a map of broken veins and desperation. He had drunk the whiskey, spent whatever coin he had scrounged, and now he was back, hungover and hollow, looking for a refund on a trade he had made in a stupor. "He's back," Thane growled, the vibration of his voice rattling the window pane. "The rat came back for the cheese." Seraphina went pale. She scrambled into the corner, crouching behind the stack of firewood, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "He can't take me," she thought, panic rising like bile. "I won't go back to the noise. I won't." "Blackwood!" Rook's voice echoed off the canyon walls, thin and reedy. "Thorn Blackwood, I know you're in there, and I know you have my niece." Thane didn't answer. He motioned for Seraphina to get down. "Send her out!" Rook screamed. "And the furs! We know you trappers keep the prime pelts for the spring trade. Give us the girl and the furs, and we'll leave you the cabin." "I have lead," Thane said to the empty room. "He can have that." He chambered around in the sharps. Clack-thud. "Last chance, Blackwood." "Burn him out!" Rook screamed to the men behind him, hired toughs from the railhead with dead eyes. "Light the roof! Smoke the bear!" The world disintegrated. 7 rifles opened up at once. Bullets hammered the logs like hail. Wood splinters flew across the room, deadly as shrapnel. The window shutter, weathered by years of ice, disintegrated under a barrage of lead. A slug punched through a chink in the logs and slammed into the cast-iron pot on the stove with a deafening gong, spraying hot water across the floor. Thane didn't flinch. He was no longer the tender nurse. He was the grave. He thrust the barrel of the sharps through the shattered window. He didn't aim for the men. He aimed for the rock face above them, where a shelf of wet, heavy snow was clinging by a thread. Boom! The heavy buffalo gun roared like a cannon. The recoil shoved Thane backward, jarring his wounded leg, but he grit his teeth. The bullet struck the rock. The vibration dislodged the snow. A sheet of white, tons of it, slid down the cliff face. It missed the men, but it spooked the horses. They reared, screaming, slipping in the mud. One rider was thrown, landing hard in the slush. "Reloading," Thane grunted, his hands a blur as he ejected the brass casing and shoved a fresh cartridge home. "They're moving!" Seraphina tapped the floorboards. Vibration. To the side. The woodshed. Thane swore. The woodshed was attached to the south wall. If they lit it, the whole cabin would go up. "Stay down!" he ordered. He rushed to the south wall, looking for a firing port. There was none. Just solid log. Outside, the whoosh of oil being thrown against wood was audible. Then the crackle. Then the smell. Smoke began to curl under the doorframe, gray and acrid. "Come out, Blackwood," Rook taunted, "or cook in there." Thane looked at Seraphina. She was huddled in the corner, her eyes wide, terrified, but she wasn't crying. She was looking around the room, looking for a weapon. "I have to go out," Thane said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper. "I have to stop the fire." He grabbed his splitting maul from the corner, a heavy iron-headed axe with a sledgehammer on the back. He checked the sharps. "Bar the door behind me," he commanded. "If anyone gets in, you silence them. You hear me, Seraphina? You silence them." Seraphina grabbed his arm, shaking her head violently. "No." "Bar the door." Thane kicked the bar up. He threw the door open. He stepped out into the smoke. He roared a sound of pure primal rage that drowned out the fire. He raised the sharps and fired from the hip, blowing a hole through the chest of the man holding the torch. The man crumpled, falling into the burning wood. Thane dropped the empty rifle. He gripped the handle of the maul with both hands. He charged. He hit the posse like a landslide. He took a bullet in the shoulder, spinning him around, but he didn't stop. He swung the maul. The heavy iron head connected with the shoulder of a gunman trying to mount his horse. The sound of breaking bone was sickeningly loud. The man screamed and went down. It was chaos. Mud, blood, and fire. Thane was a berserker, a force of nature protecting his den. He ignored the pain in his leg, moving with a terrifying, limping gait that seemed unstoppable. But inside the cabin, the war was different. Seraphina slammed the door and threw the heavy oak bar back into place. Her hands were shaking, but not with cold, with rage. She heard the screams outside. She heard Thane grunting in pain. Then she heard a sound behind her. Scrunch, crunch. The back window, the small one high up near the eaves, meant for ventilation. A face appeared there, a man with a scar across his nose and a knife between his teeth. He had climbed the woodpile. He smashed the glass with the hilt of his knife. He squeezed through the small opening, tumbling down onto the bed Thane had slept in alone for 20 years. He rolled off the furs and landed on his feet, grinning. He held a long, curved skinning knife. "Well now," the man sneered, spotting Seraphina by the door. "Looks like the bear left the honey unguarded." Seraphina backed up until she hit the table. Her hands scrambled behind her, searching. "Rook wants you back," the man laughed, stepping closer. "But he didn't say in what condition. I reckon I can have a little fun before we ride. You can't scream anyway, can you, darling?" He lunged. Seraphina didn't scream. She couldn't. But she didn't freeze. Her hand closed around the handle of the heavy copper pot sitting on the stove, the one full of boiling water she had been using to soak beans. She didn't think. She reacted. 10 years of suppressed rage, 10 years of being a mute doll, 10 years of swallowing her voice, it all exploded in a single motion. She swung the pot. Splash! A gallon of boiling water hit the gunman full in the face. He didn't just scream. He shrieked a high, inhuman sound that shattered the tension in the room. He dropped the knife. He clawed at his face, the skin blistering instantly, the water burning into his eyes. My eyes. God, my eyes. He stumbled back, blind and agonizing, crashing into the table. Seraphina didn't stop. She grabbed the butcher knife from the table, the same knife she had used to cut the rot from Thane's leg. She advanced. The gunman swung blindly, his fists hitting empty air. "Where are you, you little witch?" Seraphina stepped in. She didn't hesitate. She drove the knife into his thigh. He howled and collapsed, curling into a ball on the floor, sobbing. Seraphina stood over him, heaving. She held the bloody knife. She looked down at the man who had thought her silence meant weakness. She stomped her boot on the floor. Thud. The man flinched, terrified of the sound. Outside, the shooting stopped. The door rattled. "Seraphina," it was Thane's voice. "Open the door." Seraphina lowered the knife. She ran to the door, throwing the bar up. Thane fell into the room. He was covered in mud and blood, mostly not his own, though his left shoulder was bleeding sluggishly. He looked wild, his eyes wide and frantic. He saw the man on the floor. He saw the blood pooling around his leg. He saw the steam rising from the wet floorboards. Then he saw Seraphina. She was standing over the body. She was breathing hard, her hair wild, her apron soaked with water and splattered with the intruder's blood. She was gripping the knife so tight, her knuckles were white. Thane stared at her. He had left a victim in the cabin. He had returned to find a warrior. He came through the window, Thane realized, seeing the glass. Seraphina looked at him. Her eyes were fierce. She pointed to the man, then to her ear. He screamed. She sighed, loud. Thane limped toward her. He didn't look at the intruder. He looked at her. He saw the fire in her eyes, a fire he had helped kindle, but which was now burning with its own terrifying heat. "Is Rook dead?" she asked, with her hands a quick, cutting motion. "Not yet," Thane growled, turning back to the door. "He ran. He's hiding in the rocks, but he's hurt." He reached out and gently took the knife from her hand. He set it on the table. Then he pulled his heavy Walker Colt revolver from his belt. He pressed it into her hand. It was warm from his body. "If he moves," Thane said, pointing to the man on the floor, "you finish it. I have to end this." Seraphina wrapped both hands around the heavy grip of the gun. She looked Thane in the eye. She nodded once. "Go!" Thane turned and walked back out into the smoke, not as a protector shielding a helpless woman, but as a partner clearing the field for the life they were going to build. The silence of the mountain was about to return, but this time it would be purchased with lead. The twilight that hung over the peaks was a bruised purple, the color of a healing wound. The air outside the cabin smelled of sulfur and wet earth, sharp enough to sting the back of Thane's throat as he stepped onto the porch. The yard was a graveyard of good intentions and bad men. The bodies of the hired guns lay where they had fallen in the mud, dark shapes rapidly being covered by the returning snow. But one shape was still moving. Elias Rook was dragging himself toward the tree line. He was breathing in wet, rattling gasps, clutching his side where a splinter from the woodshed explosion had likely caught him. He was fumbling with his belt, desperate to run, desperate to find a bottle, desperate to survive the monster he had awakened. He heard the heavy thud of Thane's boots on the wood. Rook froze. He turned slowly, his face a mask of mud and terror. He saw the mountain man standing there, silhouetted against the dark interior of the cabin, the heavy splitting maul resting on the porch rail, dripping onto the snow. "Blackwood," Rook wheezed, raising a shaking hand. "Now, let's be reasonable. We're kin in a way, by marriage." Thane didn't speak. He walked down the steps. The snow crunched under his boots, a sound Rook flinched at. "I have contacts," Rook stammered, his eyes darting to the massive hands that had just crushed his posse. "In Denver, I can get you. I can get you the deed to the land, free and clear." "I own the land," Thane rumbled, his voice low and vibrating with the memory of Seraphina shivering on a poker table. "The mountain gave it to me." Rook's hand dipped toward his boot. It was a reflex, the last desperate gamble of a cornered rat. He went for a hideout knife. Thane didn't hesitate. He didn't rush. He simply kept walking. Rook fumbled the knife. It slipped from his shaking, frozen fingers and fell into the slush. "No!" Rook shrieked, scrambling backward, kicking up mud. "Don't! She's just a mute! She's damaged goods! I did you a favor!" Thane stopped. He looked down at the man who had traded his own flesh and blood for a bottle of rye. "She ain't damaged," Thane whispered, the sound cutting through the thin air like a razor. "She's just quiet, and the world needs more quiet." Rook opened his mouth to scream, to beg, to make more noise. Thane reached down. He didn't strike him. He grabbed Rook by the collar and hoisted him up, slamming him against the rough bark of a pine tree. "You like the noise, Elias?" Thane asked softly. "You like the shouting? The bargaining?" Rook whimpered, his feet dangling. "Hush," Thane said. He let go. Rook slumped to the ground, sobbing, broken by the sheer terrifying proximity of death. He looked up, expecting the blow. "Start walking," Thane said, pointing down the mountain toward the pass that was rapidly icing over. "Walking?" Rook gasped. "But it's 20 miles. I have no coat. I have no horse." Then you better walk fast, Thane said, turning his back, before the silence catches you. He walked back to the cabin. He didn't look back when Rook scrambled to his feet and began to limp down the trail, weeping into the coming night. The mountain would take him. The cold would do what a bullet couldn't. It would strip him down to his soul and leave him silent forever. Inside, the cabin was dim, lit only by the embers of the fire and the gray light filtering through the shattered window. Seraphina was standing by the table, the heavy Walker Colt still gripped in both hands, pointed at the door. When she saw it was him, she lowered the gun, her knees giving way. She sank onto the bench, the adrenaline crashing out of her system and leaving her shaking like a leaf. Thane limped to the hearth. He dropped the bar across the door, a finality. He turned to her. He looked at the water on her apron, now stained with blood. He looked at the fierce set of her jaw that was softening into relief. He tried to take a step toward her, but the room spun. The blood loss from his shoulder was catching up to him. He stumbled, catching himself on the back of the chair. Seraphina was there in a second. She dropped the gun and grabbed his good arm, guiding him to the stool. "I'm fine," he lied, his face gray. "Just a scratch." Seraphina ignored him. She pushed him down onto the stool. She fetched the basin and the rag. She worked in silence, washing the blood away with a tenderness that belied the violence of the last hour. She bandaged the arm with strips of clean linen, her large, capable hands moving with surgical precision. When she finished binding the wound, she sat back on her heels, wiping sweat from her forehead. Thane looked at her. He looked at the cabin, the shattered window, the blood on the floor, the soot stains on the ceiling. He stood up, swaying slightly. He walked to the corner of the room, to a large wooden chest reinforced with iron bands. He kicked the latch open. Inside was his hoard, not gold, but fur, prime winter pelts, silver fox, marten, thick beaver, and a massive stack of buffalo hides. It was a fortune. Enough to buy a house in St. Louis, enough to buy a life. He began to pull them out. He piled them on the table, a mountain of soft, shimmering fur. "Take it," Thane rasped. He wouldn't meet her eyes. Seraphina froze. She tilted her head, confused. "The pass is open," Thane said, his voice hard and flat, trying to crush the hope in his own heart before it could kill him. "Rook is gone, but the world is full of Rooks, men who see a quiet woman and think she's a victim." He pushed the pile of furs toward her. "This is worth thousands. Take the Clydesdale. Ride to the railhead. Go to the city. Find a doctor who can fix your voice. Find a life where you don't have to boil men's faces to survive." He turned to look at her then, and the misery in his eyes was bottomless. "I am a grave, Seraphina. That's what they call me, and graves are for the dead. You are alive. You deserve music. You deserve to hear people laughing, not just the wind screaming." Seraphina stared at the furs. She looked at the door. Then she looked at Thane. She stood up. She walked to the table. She picked up the top pelt, a silver fox skin, soft as a cloud, and worth more than the saloon she was sold in. She walked to the stove. Thane watched her, confused. "What are you doing?" Seraphina opened the stove door. The fire roared, hungry for fuel. She looked at Thane. Her eyes were defiant. She threw the pelt into the fire. Whoosh! The fur caught instantly, shriveling and burning, filling the room with the acrid smell of singed hair. Thane lunged forward. "Woman, are you mad? That's a fortune!" Seraphina grabbed another pelt. She threw it in. Thane grabbed her wrist. "Stop it! That's your freedom!" Seraphina yanked her wrist free. She grabbed the slate she used for tallying supplies. She snatched up the chalk. She wrote furiously, the chalk snapping under the pressure of her hand. She held the slate up to his face. "Freedom is loud." Safety is silent. I choose the grave. Thane stared at the words. The chalk dust drifted in the air between them. Seraphina dropped the slate. She walked up to him, invading his space, forcing him to look down at her. She reached up and took his face in her hands, her thumbs tracing the scars that ran through his beard. She pulled his head down. She pressed her forehead against his, closing her eyes. She took his hand and placed it on her throat. She hummed, a low, steady, vibrating note. It wasn't a word. It was a sound of contentment, of anchoring. I am not leaving, the vibration said. I was sold for a bottle. I will not be bought out by a pelt. Thane broke. A sound that was half sob, half laugh ripped out of his chest. He wrapped his massive arms around her, lifting her off the floor, burying his face in her neck. He held her with a desperation that shook them both. You stubborn, silent woman, he groaned into her hair. You foolish, beautiful woman. He carried her to the bed he had slept in alone for 20 years. He sat down, pulling her into his lap, unwilling to let her go even for a second. I vowed to silence the world, he whispered, rocking her gently. But I never thought I'd find someone who would help me keep it that way. Seraphina smiled, burying her face in his chest. She listened to his heart. It was beating fast, but it was steady. Outside, the snow began to fall again, covering the blood in the yard, covering the tracks of the uncle who walked to his doom. The silence returned to the mountain, absolute and heavy. But inside it wasn't empty. It was full. Epilogue 1 year later. The summer sun in the Rockies was a brilliant, blinding gold, turning the alpine meadow behind the cabin into a riot of wildflowers, bluebells, Indian paintbrush, and fireweed. The cabin had changed. The shattered window was replaced with clear glass that sparkled in the light. A garden patch, fenced high against the deer, was blooming with hardy potatoes and herbs. On the porch, a wide swing bench hung from heavy chains. Thane sat on the bench. He was older, the gray in his beard more pronounced, but the haunted look in his eyes was gone, replaced by a calm, watchful peace. He held a book in his hands, a battered copy of poetry he had traded 3 beaver pelts for in town. Seraphina sat beside him, her head resting on his shoulder. She was sewing a small shirt, her fingers moving with the same dexterity that had stitched his coat. Thane cleared his throat. He began to read aloud. His voice was no longer a rusty, unused thing. It was deep, rich, a baritone rumble that resonated in the wood of the porch. She walks in beauty, like the night, of cloudless climes and starry skies. He stopped. He looked down at her. Seraphina looked up. She smiled, her eyes crinkled at the corners. She reached out and touched his lips. More, she sighed. Thane chuckled. He kissed her fingertips. Greedy, he teased gently. He turned the page. From inside the cabin, a sound drifted out. Not a scream, not a shout. A coo. A baby's gurgle. Thane stopped reading. He looked at the door. He's awake, Thane whispered. Seraphina nodded. She stood up, smoothing her apron. He's loud, Thane said, feigning annoyance, though his eyes were shining with pride. He has your lungs, Seraphina, even if you don't use them. Seraphina grinned. She walked to the door, paused, and looked back at him. She put a finger to her lips. Hush, she sighed. He is speaking our language. Thane watched her go inside to tend to their son. He looked out at the valley, at the green pines and the soaring hawks. The world down below was still noisy, full of men like Rook, full of clatter and pain. But up here, above the timberline, the only sounds were the ones they chose to make. Thane Blackwood closed the book. He closed his eyes, And for the first time in his life, he didn't listen for the enemy. He just listened to the silence, and found it was the sweetest song he had ever heard.